Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the 1Mby1M podcast. Today, we're going to discuss corporate innovation, and my guest is Anita Sands, who's on a number of Silicon Valley and technology industry boards and has had a long career in the financial service industry in the innovation management space. So we have a very interesting set of perspectives. Anita, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. It's a wonderful podcast. I'm very excited.
So, Anita, you have spent the first part of your career, being a physicist. So that's a really interesting training ground for someone who went on to be in the innovation ecosystem. Would you actually tell me a few things about your journey as a physicist and how that ties into where you are today in the innovation ecosystem?
Absolutely. That's a great question and an interesting story. As you rightly say, I started out life as a physicist. My undergrad was in physics and applied math, and my PhD then was in atomic and molecular physics. But I realized about midway through my PhD that I wasn't destined for a career as a research scientist, but rather I was very interested in the application of science and technology in the world. So I decided to take myself off to the United States. I had grown up in Ireland, and I then did a master's in public policy and management. So that was the first of my career pivots, if you will. And then once I had finished my studies there, I then I lived in Canada for 7 years in Toronto, and that's where I sort of undertook my second career pivot, which took me into financial services. So 4 major financial services institutions, one crisis, and about a decade later, I ended up back in New York, where my last role in financial services was as COO of UBS Wealth Management here in the Americas. And this was around, 2010, 11, 12, when everybody out here in Silicon Valley was really lighting the world up with mobile and social and cloud and big data, all the stuff we know and love today. And I was finding myself inside a Swiss bank kind of very much getting a lesson in physics every day with what happens when an unstoppable force like innovation and digital meets an immovable object like a Swiss bank. That was my life. So I decided that I would pivot again and move out to San Francisco, where I now work in the tech industry. And as you mentioned, I spend most of my time doing board work for public and private company boards, and then a lot of sort of advisory and speaking work on topics related to innovation and change. And really the lesson from my personal career trajectory has been that, learning how to deal with change, how to navigate it, whether that's within your own career or within your own work, is actually a very valuable skill to have in today's age where, as we all know, the pace of change is increasing. So I found it's been a helpful skill set to have developed, even if it was somewhat by accident rather than design.
So let's break down today's conversation in 2 major segments. One is I want to understand your perspective on innovation and transformation in the financial services space that has gone through, during your tenure, huge amount of change. And then in the second part of the conversation, I'd like to focus on your Silicon Valley board work, and in particular, you are on the board of ServiceNow, which is a hypergrowth company that Silicon Valley and the technology ecosystem is watching very, very closely, how the company is managing hypergrowth, and what have you learned and what insights can you bring from the point of view of innovation management in the context of a hypergrowth company? How does that sound?
That sounds wonderful.
All right, so let's do the first part, financial services. What were the key, changes, the vectors of change that were sweeping over the financial services industry in the 3 assignments that you had, that you particularly had to pay attention to?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think that hits on probably one of the most valuable lessons I learned about leading corporate innovation, and that is that innovation is very, very contextual. It's a function of both the time and the cycle that the industry is in, as you just referenced. It's also a function of the industry that you're operating in. So the definition of what innovation meant for a financial services firm like UBS is very different to what people at Apple or people at Boeing would think when they think about corporate innovation. So context very much matters. And the way that played out over the time that I was in the banking industry was I started running innovation teams before the financial crisis. And during that time, we were really focused on emerging technologies. It would have been the start of what is now all things digital. I guess it was sort of Web 2.0 kind of stuff back then. But we were very much looking at emerging technologies and trying to think about new ways to enhance the customer experience or drive revenue growth. Of course, then once the crisis hit, the context changed entirely. And when you were running a team that had sort of the change the bank skill set, our mandate was then to figure out how to re-engineer processes, really with a goal of taking out a lot of cost and doing that as quickly and as thoughtfully as possible, because obviously you have to manage a lot of operational risk. So that was sort of the first valuable thing I learned, was that context matters, timing matters, and your starting point matters too. I mean, I still talk to a lot of my colleagues in financial services, and, they express frustration sometimes that they wish they could just do everything as quickly and with the same level of agility as a startup can. But the fact of the matter is that, if you're operating inside a large, complex, established firm, you have a lot of inherent complexity, you have a lot of legacy, and that legacy takes all kinds of forms, from legacy technology, processes, practices, training, and particularly legacy mindsets. So the starting point of where you're coming from when you're trying to sort of drive an innovation agenda is really important. And if you don't have adequate awareness of that, I think you're destined to sort of set up yourself for, in the wrong situation, with the wrong context, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, that's what you said reminds me of an anecdote. We have a close relationship with Intuit, and the time that I'm describing, this is probably a few years ago, and Snapchat was incredibly hot. Snapchat being a consumer, social media thing that mostly teenagers and young adults use. We had this conversation inside of Intuit. I was talking to at the time, Chief Innovation Officer, I think, of Intuit, and he said, well, we had in our innovation program, a project like that came up, and we basically chose not to pursue it. So I turned around and said, why are you saying this as if you regret that? Because you made the right decision. Snapchat or equivalent should not be part of Intuit's innovation agenda. It's contextually relevant.
That's right. And that was one of the most important points, actually, I had to drive alignment around this idea that, just because something's possible doesn't mean that you should pursue it. And I actually found it was very important, just the point you were making, to bring people onto the same page relative to what innovation is and isn't in a given firm. And my working definition, what I ended up using as my mantra, was that innovation connects what's possible to what's valuable. So just because something is possible, like your example with Snapchat, it wasn't going to be valuable to Intuit's customers. So I think that's a very important point for corporations to be disciplined around, because at the end of the day, they may have a lot more resources to pursue innovation than a startup has, but they don't have infinite capacity in terms of time. And they're still trying to run a successful, growing organization as well. So you actually have to be quite disciplined about making sure you're focusing on the value that your innovation can drive, and that's relevant to your customers.
Yes. So, another point that you and I have talked about in our offline conversations that I would like to pursue a little more diligently here. So again, as you know, 1Mby1M has an innovation program, and we work with various corporations. And part of that incubator in a box enables corporate innovation in the context of intrapreneurship. And one thing we have learned, and this has been now many years, we're doing this for 5-6 years, and one thing we have seen is a lot of projects that come out of intrapreneurship programs for, let's say, an Oracle, could be incremental projects, could be process innovation that improves the process, and it's not earth-shattering, it's not a moonshot, it's not it's not going to change, it's not going to create $5 billion worth of revenue, but it is an innovation, it is a piece of innovation, it is something that creates tremendous efficiency within the organization. It may not be glamorous, but it's valuable.
Yes, exactly. You're so right. I mean, and then again, that's exactly why the context matters, right? So if you're dealing with the oracles of the world, you have a couple of things that matter. First is that they have a lot of great assets. They have a lot of stuff that's working well. So on the margin, to your exact point, if you can incrementally improve something that's already working quite well, you can potentially retain all of that intrinsic value and add to it. So that was another thing I used to try and focus people around, is that, innovation is focused on adding new value, not just necessarily new things, right? And often the combination of a couple of things that you have inside a company like Oracle, maybe you have a data set here that combined with a new piece of technology over there could release incremental value. So I really do think that it's an important element of an innovation program is to focus on small changes, on incremental value. And the reason why I think that's important is that, you talked about generating this notion of entrepreneurship, and that's cultural as much as it is a practice or a policy. And when you get people into a mindset of continuous improvement and incremental change, you are generating that culture. You're kind of indicating that we value people that are looking for continuous improvement. We value people that are willing to challenge the status quo and to assumptions, and to not necessarily just accept things as we're doing them today. So I think it's very important that you make innovation everybody's job, and that you encourage your employees to seek innovation in everything they do. And therefore, if you're working in finance or you're working as an engineer, you equally have a role to play in driving innovation at an Oracle, for example. So I think, programs focused on giving people those skill sets like you have done are tremendously valuable and really help to create both the right culture and then the right mindset and the right sort of notion of responsibility that innovation is, in fact, everybody's job.
What have you concluded through your various assignments in this realm in terms of process? What processes have worked for you? What are some examples of best practices?
Yeah, so maybe let me share two, and they're kind of related. Probably the most valuable thing, as I look back on all of the bets we placed and the various processes that we put in place to try and work through innovation from ideation right through to end-to-end execution, was that innovation really works for large companies at the perfect intersection of three things. I used to describe it as sort of a three-legged stool, and if one of the legs was shorter than the other two, things would topple over and not work. So the three things are, first of all, there needs to be a market need. There needs to be a customer need for the problem. The second is that there has to be a business model. There has to be a way to make a buck or save a buck, if that's what you're looking to do. And the third thing is that there has to be a technology that is robust, mature, and scalable enough to support your idea, to develop your solution at the scale that a large enterprise needs. And if one of those three things isn't right at the right moment in time and they don't come together perfectly, then it won't work. And a great example for us was probably the early days of mobile payments back in, this would have been like the 2006-07 era. I was working in Canada, and we knew mobile payments were coming. We absolutely knew that it was going to be something the bank would end up doing and doing a lot of, and we were starting to explore the territory and how we might engage. What was very clear at that time, though, was that the market need wasn't fully there yet. At that time, when we started going to market with it, it was clear in Canada that only certain segments of the population actually wanted to adopt mobile payments there and then. They were mostly immigrants or younger people. It wasn't the mass market adoption that you see today. The second thing that we ran into was from a business model perspective, it wasn't clear between the banks and the telcos who would actually own the relationship with the customer and how the economics would work. And then the third thing was, from a technology standpoint, so this was pre-iPhone and so forth, really the only way to deliver mobile payments were through SMS messaging. So that was a very limited kind of technology architecture for us to sort of try and work with. So it was a really valuable lesson in looking back, and all you needed to do was roll the clock on kind of a couple of years, and with the introduction of the iPhone, mass adoption and so forth, you could see how the market was going to move quickly, but you have to get your timing right. So that was one very valuable process lesson that I learned. The second is that when I talk to a lot of companies, I'm sure you've seen this too with your work, they talk about having kind of a funnel. And, you know, they might start with 100 great ideas wherever they source them from, and they get down and their batting average is maybe 1 to maybe it's 4 out of 100 that actually end up being executed and fully in market. And I actually, when I look back now, I realize that a funnel is the wrong concept. A better concept is kind of like a conveyor belt, because the pace of change is so fast now that some of the reasons why you decided not to pursue a certain idea at a point in time may have shifted. So you need to have a around being willing to revisit ideas and accept that your assumptions may have changed. The conclusions you reached may now no longer be valid. But I've seen a lot of teams, you know, when maybe it's a new person that comes to the company and they say, hey, what about X, Y, Z? And the incumbent kind of, you know, tenured employees say, oh, no, we tried that 2 years ago, it didn't work, or we looked at that before and that doesn't apply here. And that may have been the right answer at the right time, but that's not to say that the conditions and the underlying circumstances haven't changed. So they're my two most valuable lessons.
That's a very good point. You know, so in our process, there are a few things that we have learned that speak to some of the points you're pointing out. So we do, with our partners who are using our methodology, we do contests. You know, twice a year we do contests, a fall challenge and a spring challenge, where we invite from the organization. Let's say a company has 100,000 employees. All 100,000 employees are invited to present applications that they want to learn this methodology, the 1Mby1M methodology of innovation, and apply to be part of a structured innovation program. And then the corporation gets to choose which projects are going to be actually supported, whether it's process innovation or product innovation, whichever one. So far we only work with technology product companies. So the methodology is very much technology product company oriented. But your point about timing is very interesting, because, you know, in some cases, somebody within the organization will come up with an idea as they're going through the program with us. They will come up with an idea, and that idea may have competitors in the startup market, and that's validation in itself, because if it's a venture funded company out there that somebody else has done due diligence that's already out there, then the company has to make a choice of whether it's a build versus buy decision, right? Is it worthwhile buying this company for a very, you know, huge amount of money, or is it something that you just build and then you have the channel already? An Oracle or a ServiceNow would have the channel. So it's basically, you know, if it's a development project that can directly go in through the channel to the existing customer base, you can kind of leapfrog the startup's entire cycle of development doing that. And that is a timing question, I think.
Yeah, and a skill
you
set
have
question.
The time to do that or not.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's another challenge that organizations fail to understand, is that you have to create capacity for change. You have to create the capacity and you have to create the capability. So that's why I think like a method like yours and a sort of a very structured program that gives everybody kind of transparency into how innovation is going to work and where those good ideas that are coming from employees are actually going to go, because that's another issue is that you see companies going, okay, well, we'll put out sort of an ideation platform and we'll get all these great ideas from our employees, which they do, and then they fail to execute on any of them. And that actually can create a huge sense of disillusionment. It's one thing to know that your idea was looked at and not pursued for all the right reasons and, looked at objectively with criteria. It's another thing just to feel like it's vanished into a black hole. And
that's exactly right. Yeah. That's exactly right. So I'm going to make a couple of points on what you just said to underscore what you said, but just going back to your timing point, I was talking to head of commercial banking in American Express, and she explained to me that American Express waited a long time before they got into this kind of micro-lending business, which companies like On Deck and Lending Club are doing. Lending Club is peer-to-peer. On Deck is actually lending working capital loans. American Express just sat on the sidelines and waited. And then they created their own version of that. And that's going really well. Intuit, by the way, has done the same thing. They are doing working capital lending with their own money within their own platform. They didn't buy. They actually built it themselves, but they waited for the right time, for the technology to mature. Your point about the technology maturing and the market maturing to some extent, when you're making these timing decisions from the point of view of a large company, it's actually better to wait a little bit for the technology to mature before jumping in and going into a field which is very new.
Exactly, because you have to do it at scale, right? If
you have to do it at scale, exactly.
Yeah, and it's got to be hardened, and otherwise, you do run the risk of actually, you might be pursuing a great innovative idea, but you may run into a lot of reputational damage if you roll something out to your customers and it really doesn't work. That is not in keeping with the expectations that a lot of customers have of very successful brands. And I think it's one thing for the Googles of the world to get away with releasing beta products as a little bit of a different expectation in that kind of a sphere. But for a lot of large company like a bank, they just don't get kind of to experiment. Yeah, exactly, exactly. But what I love about your point too, what really resonates with me is just fundamentally what you're talking about is there's a thoughtful discipline around innovation. And I think that's a very important word, is that, innovation, if you're going to do it successfully and do it at scale, it actually has to be quite a disciplined process. It's a creative process, but creative processes can actually be pretty disciplined. And when you put the right boundary conditions in place, I think it leads to more success rather than constraints.
Yeah. And this is a very important culture question, right? So if you talk to people who have been inside Google in the era of 20% flexible time, they'll tell you it's kind of like a madhouse, right? People are doing whatever, and not much, productivity-wise, not much is coming out of it. And you have a lot of people who are frustrated because they're doing whatever. Their ideas basically are not going anywhere because there's no structured process to evaluate those ideas and bring those ideas to bear. So it's kind of helter-skelter, and I don't think that's the way innovation processes should be run.
I agree. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Now, what we do very successfully is address that culture of giving people a platform to innovate within a structured process. And if their ideas are not adopted, there is a good reason and a good explanation why they're not adopted. For example, TAM, right? Total available market size is a very big determining factor in venture capitalists investing or not in a company. If the TAM is not $1 billion plus TAM, a VC is not going to invest in a startup. This is how the venture capital business works. It's not subjective. It's there's a very objective, very kind of good explanation of why a $200 million TAM company cannot raise venture capital. The same philosophy applies to corporations and innovation inside of corporations. There is a TAM question. If your idea is a $20 million TAM question for a $10 billion company, that is not relevant.
Exactly right. Exactly. Because the thing about for the large companies, even unlike the VC startup example, is they have a high opportunity cost, right? So every
Exactly.
dollar that's diverted in one direction inside a large company to pursue an idea or an initiative versus another has a much higher opportunity cost, and therefore I think should have a higher barrier, if you will, or a higher hurdle. Not to mention the previous point around expectations are very different for a startup versus a large company endeavoring to do something.
Yeah. The other thing that my observation looking at, and I don't know what you're seeing in both in the financial services industry as well as in the company that you're on the board of, there is this popularity of hackathons. People think hackathons are great innovation programs. I don't. I mean, hackathons are fine. They're kind of fun, but I don't think people should be investing in doing a lot of prototypes and software development without a business case analysis of an idea. What do you think?
I completely agree. I mean, I think it's just the latest incarnation of that setup for kind of unrealized expectations, because ultimately innovation is an end-to-end process. It's a disciplined end-to-end process that goes from ideating at one end right through to kind of your proofs of concept, your proofs of value, your scaling tests. But ultimately then it's got to be, in the context of a large company, it's got to be brought in and integrated into the overall operating cadence, the overall operating model of the company. So when you do something, and it's another reason I think why, big organizations that set these sort of innovation satellite hubs up, right, in kind of cool places, and they put these people in cool offices sort of away from the mothership. On one hand, I can understand the virtue of that in terms of attracting a different kind of talent and, having people work with sort of a different set of boundary conditions. But ultimately, for that to be a meaningful, valuable, incremental piece of work for the company, it's got to be integrated then into the operating model of how business gets done, how software is sold. So it's really important that you think about that from an end-to-end perspective. And to your point about the hackathons, they are fun and they are great and they are a way to engage people and get people kind of excited. But ultimately, then, how is that going to move into the operating world, right? How is that going to move into the place? I don't think it works at all.
You end up with a whole bunch of cutesy prototypes that goes absolutely nowhere, is what the end game of a hackathon is. And the way I have come to, after, several years of thinking about this and actually hands-on being in this game with a number of corporate partners, I have come to the conclusion that you have to constantly, as the ideas are germinating, you have to constantly talk to the different product managers of adjacent product lines. You have to talk to the pre-sales people who are selling adjacent product lines, who have some view into what the customers are thinking and so forth, and really make it an immersive process that is very much in touch with the organization, as opposed to being shoved away somewhere in some cutesy office some faraway place. I could not agree with you more.
Yeah. And I think you've hit on the operative word, immersive process, right, as opposed to innovation being as something you do in isolation.
Isolated,
I think that's the punchline of what we're both saying, which is right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about hypergrowth. Of course, especially in the software as a service industry, the industry is going through hypergrowth, and there are lots of great companies in the market right now that are going through hypergrowth. And you sit on the board of one of the most prominent of those, which is ServiceNow. Mm-hmm. Tell us what you have learned about managing hypergrowth.
Wow. It's first of all, it's been an amazing experience. It really has. I've been on the board for 4 years now, and the company, of course, was doing very well before I got there, and hopefully will be doing very well after I leave. But it's been an amazing experience, and I think there's some great and very valuable lessons to be learned. Probably the first and foremost, and some of these will seem kind of obvious, but actually when you really see where the rubber hits the road, they're not that obvious at all. I have yet to see a company that is as disciplined around execution, that has such a high-performance culture as ServiceNow has. And that's sort of been embedded in their genome from day one, certainly something that Frank Slootman as CEO, drove very hard. So that was probably my number one observation. The second thing is they just have a myopic focus on the customer. And from the very early days on, they really wanted to do something that could make the lives of their customer better. And they've stayed relentlessly focused on that. They're now working through kind of the creation of a customer success organization because they are becoming such a predominant player in the ecosystem of major enterprises. So that's been very important. The third thing I think was really a leadership question, right? And I give Fred Luddy, who's the original founder, a tremendous amount of credit here. Fred was a little older when he started ServiceNow. It wasn't his first rodeo. And I think he had the maturity and the foresight and the self-awareness, quite frankly, to appreciate that there was going to become a time when he wasn't the right person to lead the company. He stayed. He's actually still involved. He's still on our board. He's our chairman of our board now. So he's remained involved as an iconic figure loved by employees and customers alike. But he realized that in order to he needed to bring in kind of a professional CEO who knew how to scale a company, who knew how to put all of the pieces in place to create the success story that has happened today. So Fred handed the reins over at the right point in time to Frank Slootman. And, I'm working with and advising a lot of earlier stage startups. And many of them have this sort of technical founder, in place. And, some of them really don't have that same level of comfort or confidence or self-awareness to realize that their company could do so much better by bringing in a CEO who's actually not learning everything on the job, right? I mean, it's a great thing for these founders to embrace, running a company and starting up and getting going. But really, do you want to have to learn every single thing new on the margin as a first-time CEO? I think that jeopardizes your chances of success to quite an extent, depending on the individual in question. So, Frank knew better, and he brought in, or Fred knew better, he brought in Frank, and the rest, as they say, is history. But equally, to give Frank his dues, Frank realized that, he had taken the company, right through the IPO, right up to sort of $2 billion in revenue. They have, publicly stated objective of $4 billion in revenue by 2020, which they're on a great path to achieve. And Frank realized that, ServiceNow started by selling into the CIO organization, but it is a workflow platform that extends beyond the enterprise, across the enterprise. So now they're selling into other parts of the enterprise. They're selling into marketing. They're selling into HR. They're selling into customer service. And Frank, to his credit, said, something, could I lead this company for the next phase? Yes, I could. But is there likely somebody out there who could do a better job, who knows enterprise transformation, who knows a world beyond the CIO domain? Absolutely. And he set that expectation that when the time was coming, not when the time came, when the time was coming, that he would hand over the reins. And as a board director, that was a very, very magnanimous and, mature, thoughtful approach, because that left us in a position where when we were looking at CEO succession and recruiting a successor for Frank, we had the luxury of solving for an outcome and not a timeline. We weren't kind of forced, our hand wasn't forced to go into the market and, try and find the best of who was available. We could look at candidates over a period of time, and when we really felt we had complete conviction around a certain individual, we could act. And therefore, when John Donahoe came along, the board were just so, found his vision very compelling, found his experience very compelling. And what we loved about John were two things. One is that he comes from the consumer world. And Frank and Fred and those of us on the board had a really strong conviction that, the expectations of customers and employees are merging. And it's not okay for customers to have this seamless, frictionless, delightful experience with all of the software and the apps they're using in their home lives. And then they walk across the threshold into a company and they're dealing with these clunky, outdated, terribly designed, not intuitive enterprise IT applications. And we just don't think that's the future. We don't think that's acceptable anymore. So we wanted somebody that brought that consumer DNA into the company. And, of course, then John was also the CEO of Bain, the consulting group. So he has a very deep set of experiences in enterprise transformation. And he knows how to talk to CEOs about thinking about that. because I think as all of us, that have, you've been very heavily involved in this, innovation and transformation extends way beyond just what you do with your technologies. It's about your processes and your culture and your people. And John has an incredible amount of depth there. So I really think that there's an amazing lesson there for startups to have the thoughtfulness, have the self-awareness to know when the time is right to hand the baton onto the next guy or gal. I hope that people surround themselves with a board that can advise them to do that and can bring that objectivity to that decision. But Frank often talks about one of the hardest things for startups actually, and for a startup CEO, is realizing when you have outgrown somebody and knowing when that the person that maybe took you from 0 to 10 million, or the guy that took you from 10 to 100 million, isn't the person that can take you from 100 million to $1 billion. And it's very hard sometimes for founders, I think, to let go of that, those people that have been in the trenches with them from day one. But yet, if you want to be successful, you have to be willing to recognize when somebody is at the limits of their experience or capabilities, and including yourself. And that's the lesson we learned from Fred and from Frank.
So this is an interesting point, and I'm just going to make one comment, and then I'm going to switch us to a few other aspects of hypergrowth that I want to discuss with you. Just one thing to remember here is that some of the most successful companies in the world have been led by founder CEOs, which is, whether it's Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, they have built very large companies. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Steve Jobs actually got into a tremendously traumatic situation being fired out of Apple. And by the way, the Steve Jobs that came back to Apple is not the same Steve Jobs that left Apple.
That got fired, yeah.
He got fired, he matured, and he came back as a very different CEO. So so that that was actually warranted, probably, that he be replaced. But it was so I think it's I will defend a little bit the founder's desire to drive the vision of the company. Often, Fred actually stayed in that role for a long time before he handed things over.
He did, and he stayed in the role as head of product after he brought Frank in.
Exactly.
So I'm not advocating that the founder needs to sort of disappear, over the horizon at all. I'm just sort of, it's
a very tricky transition. I've gone through this transition myself. And I got fired we brought in a CEO, and the first thing the CEO did was fire me. And then as a result, the company lost its entire product vision. So it can be very, very tricky. The personality dynamics can be very tricky. So, but let's go to a different point, which is there are two things going on in a hypergrowth company that I want to discuss. One is the internal innovation structure, especially engaging the grassroots in innovation. And then the second point is external innovation and M&A. ServiceNow, for example, has acquired a lot of companies. Mm-hmm. So if you could speak to both of those in separate segments on how does the company think about structure and framework for internal innovation, and then structure and framework for external innovation and M&A?
Yeah. So great question. And I think the two of them are linked, or certainly can be linked. When you think about certainly some companies making acquisitions for the talent that's involved and the expertise as much as the actual product or any of the intellectual assets a company might have. You're right. ServiceNow has done quite a bit of M&A, but they have an incredibly disciplined approach to it, and they had a very kind of clear philosophy about what they were going to do. Now, I think as we look from going to 2 to 4 to 10 billion, our philosophy may change, and we may have a different approach, and we'll be disciplined about that. But up until kind of the point where we got to 2 billion. And this was really kind of under Fred's leadership, Fred and Frank, I should say. They felt that it was important to be disciplined about the potential targets they looked at. And they had a very fundamental belief that unless a company they acquired, unless that technology could be written into the code base of ServiceNow, could be not completely integrated into our platform, that it wasn't something they were going to do. And that meant when we were in discussions with startups and other companies we were looking at, that had to be something that team and that founding team were willing to work with us on, because we felt very strongly that we did not want to get into having multiple code bases. We didn't want to get into a situation where we would make that more complex for our customers as to what version they were on and so forth. We felt that it was an important element of the discipline to rewrite every single M&A opportunity into our code base and fully integrate it and fully integrate the team in. So that was core to our philosophy in the past. Now, like I said, going forward, will that approach differ? And, if you look at kind of the Oracles or the Ciscos or whatever of the world, they've obviously had very different philosophies around M&A, and that's okay. So I'm not, advocating for one or the other. I just think what's important is that you are thoughtful about what your criteria are and why. And that may change over time, but that was what we did up until this point. In terms of internal innovation, let me maybe just make two comments. First of all, what I would say sets ServiceNow aside, and you probably have way more data points than I do, but my observation is they very much focus their innovation efforts and their roadmaps around the feedback they were getting from customers. So they really kept that loop very, very kind of tightly in place. And they didn't sort of, let themselves get distracted by kind of the shiny object syndrome of, well, we could do X, Y, Z. It's back to what we were talking about earlier, that, innovation has to connect what's possible to what's valuable. So they stayed very focused on what was going to add value to the customer, what were they hearing in terms of feedback, what their customers were hoping to see next in terms of our platform. So that was one element of the vision. The second thing they did was they were very thoughtful about keeping, the product piece, the sales piece, and the financial piece all kind of lined up, and having a vision and having a strategy, but making sure that all three kind of elements of the operational side of it were very much aligned. So they didn't let the product innovation get way out ahead of what the sales teams could actually sell. And vice versa, they didn't let the sales guys go into the field promising a bunch of things that the product team couldn't ultimately deliver. So I guess I'm back to this point of there was a lot of discipline around how they approached innovation and so forth. So they're probably two of my main observations. The other thing that they recognized was that just from an end-to-end perspective, it's one thing to be like a single product, single channel, single geography company. When you're making that move, as a lot of startups, who are successful do, into being multi-product, multi-channel, multi-geography, they set themselves up structurally in a different way. And that was actually a bit of a bumpy transition for us. It was kind of rough over a couple of quarters as everybody realigned into the new org design and org structure. But it was, again, so critical to do before we needed to do it, so that we were set up on the right rails, and then that each of the individual product application teams could focus on what they needed to do and move their part of the organization forward. So that was important for us as well. But maybe the singular piece that I think some startups struggle with is what is Act 2, right? So a lot of them have this amazing original vision. They have spotted a hole in the market. Yeah. And they have, then they've spotted a gap, they've spotted a problem, they've developed a solution, and they're up and running, and they're making a success of it, and they're at a certain point. But at some point, there has to be a second act, right? You have to know what's coming next. And I've seen companies struggle with that and leaving it too late. So then they start, and unfortunately, the times are such that just the expectations around kind of sustained growth at these incredible levels are so high that once you kind of come through your IPO and that growth starts to taper off from 60% year over year to 30% year over year, people start to go, but what next, right? And it's important to be way out ahead of that as well, I think.
So just listening to you, I love this whole, keeping all your innovation process tied to customers bit. And I think, that may yield slightly less glamorous, innovation, but it really keeps, I think, a good solid innovation process running. The thing that is tricky at the stage that ServiceNow is, it's still going through hypergrowth, but it's now getting to a much larger organization, right? It's over 7,000 people, and and there are a lot of people through the grapevine, through the grassroots, that are connected to customers in different ways, right? Somebody knows something about a customer, an aspect of a customer, a particular need of a customer, and this could be a relatively junior engineer or a pre-sales engineer, but there needs to be process to bring that knowledge and insight back into the decision makers through a sustained process, so that you are not missing opportunities for Act 3 and Act 5 and Act 10 as this company scales. And that's where I think a lot of innovation processes are failing right now. There's a lot of innovation opportunities, customer immersive innovation opportunities that are left on the table because the grassroots are not tied into the decision-making process in the product organization.
Right. And that is, I think you're spot on about that. It's one of the things that gets more difficult as you scale, but so many things get more difficult as you scale. But and that's central to what you're talking about, so is the flow of information. That I think organizations have been structured in such a way historically that information flows effectively from the top down. But what happens, as you rightly say, when somebody on the front lines actually has that really insightful piece of information from the customer, how does that information flow back up to the organization? So I believe that as we migrate more towards kind of this sort of agile, more modular way of structuring ourselves as companies, which reflects kind of the dominant technology of today, I do think companies are going to have to, I'm not saying ServiceNow has got this right yet, or, but I think we're on a learning curve like so many others, but I do think it's going to be so important to empower those teams at the front lines, to give them a certain degree of autonomy around how they operate, but then to have some mechanism where things are loosely coupled together and there is alignment.
You need methodology. You need methodology that ties those pieces together.
Yeah, I think
so. The other
for big companies.
The other thing you said about the M&A policy and the extreme thoughtfulness, and I see Fred in this, right? I know Fred. He's such a thoughtful and deep man. So I hear you describe it and I see Fred's face. So it's actually in the process of ensuring that there is code-based compatibility and so forth. There's one thing that comes to my mind is that you have to catch them early. If you want to have that level of compatibility, you have to catch these acquisition opportunities early. And very often I talk to CEOs about how do they keep in touch with companies that they want to acquire. And they say, we talk to VCs. We are in touch with all the VCs. Our corp dev team is in touch with all the VCs. And I'm thinking, that's maybe too late. If you want to really, have a good view into who are the players in your industry who are doing innovative work, and if you want to really know who they are early, you need to have, again, process, methodology, mechanism to be able to be in touch with these people a lot earlier so that you have an ability to influence how they're structuring their code and how they're organized. And then if they do succeed, they do validate, if you do want to acquire them, then the acquisition is a seamless acquisition. But if you don't have those relationships and those touch points early on, then you're going to inherit companies that are much further along, heavily venture funded, the price tags go up, and the compatibility is not as seamless.
Yeah. No, you're so right. I mean, we see that a lot at Symantec, which is another company I'm on the board of, because the cybersecurity space is so dynamic, and there's so many emerging technologies and M&A centric, and it's just really hard to make that judgment call as to when the timing is right for something. You talk a lot about this being an ecosystem, right? And it is. So,
Right.
In an ecosystem, you have to be, very holistic and very open-minded about where you're sourcing your thoughts from, what you're exposing yourself to, and are you getting that kind of diversity of exposure and perspective. So I think the VCs are an important stakeholder, obviously, and they have a lot of exposure to some good stuff, but it extends far beyond that. The one lesson I probably learned from Fred Luddy about this is Fred was always very, he was great at reminding us not to stick our heads in the sand, not to be an ostrich about what was happening out there on the landscape. And as you become more successful, you can drink a little bit of your Kool-Aid, and it can get easier to dismiss some of these emerging players. And Fred, I remember in many board meetings used to say, like find out what is it about these new players that customers love. What do they like about them, right? So, when the Slacks of the world started to appear, like what is it about Slack that people actually love?
Yep,
and it's
yep.
so important for you to be open-minded about the fact that your competitor may have something that customers love, and you need to pay attention to that and not be defensive about it. So Fred was really great because, as you said so rightly, he is very thoughtful, but he also remained very strong in his conviction that he was there to do the right thing for the customers. He wanted to make the world of work better for people, right? That's the mission of the company. And he was open-minded, therefore, as to where he should think and how he should think as the landscape started to shift, right? Yeah. And I think just having an open-mindedness and an ability to, as you rightly say, get out there and talk to a broad set of stakeholders, and including customers, and make sure you understand how things are shifting.
Great. Well, fabulous conversation, Anita. We are coming to the end of the scheduled time, so let me offer you an opportunity to make some closing comments, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. I'm sure we could go on for another 3 hours.
I love it. Well, look, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you this morning. It's been a pleasure. I've been a huge fan of your work, and I think all of the incredible content on your website has so much to offer any of us in the ecosystem, whether you're working with a small startup or you're on the board of a large incumbent. So I really thank you for your contributions to this really important ecosystem and this incredibly important topic. So thank you so much for the chance to chat today.
Fantastic. And audience, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with us. I will come back to you with more of these corporate innovation perspectives. And of course, we also have lots of entrepreneur perspectives, investor perspectives, and all kinds of perspectives that help you make better decisions as you navigate through your strategy. So see you soon and talk to you again. Bye-bye.